Good afternoon, everybody. I think we couldn't have hoped for a better start of the conference, and I learned a great deal from this morning's papers and our conversations, so thanks from my side for that as well. My name is Karin Krause, and I am an assistant professor of Byzantine theology and visual culture here at the Divinity School, and it's my pleasure to chair session 2 of this conference on the idea of the global. It's my pleasure to introduce to you Adam Becker. Professor Becker's research interests include Christian martyr texts in Sasanian Iran, Jewish-Christian relations in late antiquity, the social and intellectual history of the Syriac Christian Aramaic tradition, and the missionary encounter in the 19th century. His book, Fear of God and the Beginning of Wisdom, the School of Nisibis and the Development of Christian Scholastic Culture in Late Antique Mesopotamia, was published by the University of Pennsylvania Press in 2006. The book grounds the reception of Greek philosophical and patristic literature in the social life of Christian schools in the Sasanian Empire. In 2015 was published his book Revival and Awakening, American Evangelical Missionaries in Iran and the Origins of Assyrian Nationalism by the University of Chicago Press. In it, Becker links the development of secular nationalism among Christians in the 19th century Middle East to American Protestant ideas of religious reform. Adam Becker is currently editing some of the works attributed to Isaac of Antioch, a Syriac poet of the 5th to 6th century. Professor Becker's editorial work forms part of a larger project on ethical exhortation and the perceived moral failure of Christianization in late antique Syria. I look forward to his paper that has a nice title, The Pre-Global, Global, Going Global. Please join me in welcoming Adam Becker.
Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for the hospitality that I've received. I have to apologize for the title. It was my first thought in response to the question we were asked in the invitation to this event. It was a question about the rubric of global Christianity. So how useful is it? And I thought, well, obviously the Church of the East, the church that I've done a lot of work on, the Church of the East was global in a way. It had spread across Asia by the late first millennium CE, and so it's long been global in the simple sense of the term. But on the other hand, there is something different about the Church of the East in the modern period, and so it was already global, but then it also went global. So that was my pre-global, global, going global. So what is the exact meaning of global and global Christianity? I know there are more nuanced ideas about this, because people have actually thought about this a lot more. And so in a way, it's daunting to speak after Professor Robert, because she just gave this whole history of the development of world Christianity, global Christianity, these categories. And I'm approaching this as someone who never really thought about it before, and then just said, okay, well, what does global Christianity do for me as a historian, whatever I work on? So these were my thoughts about that, and I was aware that there was another conversation, but I wasn't going to get too involved in that. So I hope that my own ignorance about the history of this usage is refreshing. For me, at least, the expression improves upon world Christianity, which seems to just kind of implied like the global South and perhaps also Asia, but it somehow implies to me non-European. Rather, global Christianity suggests to me a self-consciousness about Christianity's global movement, including via modern Western missions, and the complex dynamic of Christianity in the contemporary world. However, again, was the Church of the East not engaged in global movement long before all this? Global could mean universalizing or open to translation in various senses of the word translation, But in that case, Christianity was already global during the Roman Empire. Similarly, if global means deterritorialized or disembedded, Christianity has always been deterritorialized, even within its various localizations, and even disembedded in as much as the emergence of Christianity was an important step in the process of the development of the category of religion itself. Or is global an analytical term that emphasizes a certain characteristic of Christianity that has always been there, but which has been sped up within the modern period? And this would fit with the idea that modernity should not be characterized by its content, but by its pace. Yet, is there something more global about contemporary Christianity? Something like faster, more globaler, whatever, if that's not even a word. What would this be? So I'm going to leave these questions about the global and then return to them in the end. In my paper, I'd like to address the modern history of the Church of the East, and then bring us back later to the question of the global. Now, I work on the Syriac Christian tradition. I work on this tradition in late antiquity and the early Islamic period, so like 4th into the 8th centuries, but also in the 19th and early 20th century. My 2015 book, Revival and Awakening, American Missionaries in Iran and the Origins of Assyrian Nationalism, was a study, as the name suggests, of how the missionary encounter between members of the Church of the East and American evangelical Christians resulted in the unintended consequence of Assyrian nationalism. Whereas my mission book focused on the effects of mission, especially evangelical missions, on a Middle Eastern church, and what I use the expression missionary modernity in the book. What I want to focus on today is how in the mission encounter certain characteristics the East Syrian tradition had in common with American missionary Christianity, because of their distantly shared Christian heritage, were articulated in a new way in this encounter. And this may point to one way of thinking about the global. So I should give you some background. The Assyrians are an ethno-religious community who in the early 20th century lived primarily in the region of what is now southeastern Turkey, northern Iraq, and northwestern Iran. They're part of a broader Syriac Christian tradition, which includes other churches such as the Syrian Orthodox and the Maronites. Syriac is a dialect of Aramaic, attested first in the 2nd century CE in Edessa, modern Urfa in Turkey. It came to function as Latin did for the Catholic Church as a language of liturgy and intellectual engagement, even while members of the Syriac churches increasingly became speakers of Arabic, Neo-Aramaic, and various other languages. Living today in Iran and Iraq, as well as scattered in a worldwide diaspora, there's a large community, in fact, in Chicago, an old community going back to the late 19th century of Assyrians. The Assyrians are part of a larger Syriac or Christian Aramaic community that numbers perhaps as many as 3 million, and this does not include the large Syriac Christian communities in South India. Historically, the Assyrians belonged to the Church of the East, a separate ecclesiastical entity deriving from the Christological disputes of the 5th century. In Western sources, even up to the present, East Syrians, as members of the Church of the East, are commonly referred to as Nestorians, after Nestorius, the 5th century supposed founder of their heresy. By the time of the Arab conquest in the mid-7th century, the Church's hierarchy extended through central Iraq down into southern Iran and the Persian Gulf, and its successful proselytism was already aimed eastward into Central Asia, where Christianity would most famously prove attractive to the Mongols centuries later. So, for example, Kublai Khan's mother was a Nestorian Christian. With the exception of communities in South India, by the 19th century, the Church of the East had shrunk, and the majority of those members in northern Iraq, for example, around Mosul, had joined the Uniate Catholic Church, commonly known today as the Chaldeans. Old church membership persisted in the plains west of Lake Urmia, today in northwestern Iran, and in the mountains of Hakkari in modern Turkey. When the American mission was first established in Urmia in the 1830s, the Nestorians, or the Syrians as they usually called themselves, identified as members of the Church of the East, as well as with their local tribes and villages. Today, in contrast, the East Syrians call themselves Assyrians. Within the context of foreign missions, especially the American mission, By the turn of the 20th century, a national consciousness had developed whereby many Assyrians understood themselves to be descendants of an ancient Near Eastern nation, even a separate race. In my book, Revival and Awakening, I demonstrate how the presence of American evangelical missionaries in the borderlands between Qajar, Iran, and the Ottoman Empire contributed to the development of a secularized, but not desacralized, national identity among the indigenous Christian population of the region. The Americans aimed to reform and revive the ancient Church of the East by establishing schools, publishing and distributing literature in the vernacular, and preaching a penitential return to biblical Christianity. However, their intervention in the region helped rather to lay the groundwork for a new identity and communal understanding articulated by the East Syrians, many of whom then started to call themselves Assyrians. And this begins, the focus on the name Assyrian begins in the 1890s, but it really takes off in the context of World War I and the Assyrian genocide, and then in diaspora from the 1920s onwards. So it actually goes global. The church membership, in a sense, goes global, and this Assyrian identity is taken up further. One of the arguments in my work is that it was only after a national consciousness and national ways of relating to one another and others had come into being that the East Syrians then took up the name Assyrian. By the turn of the 20th century, some East Syrian nationalists responded autoethnographically to the Orientalist and biblical archaeological knowledge, which was disseminated by the missions in vernacular publications, by locating their origins historically in the ancient Near East. They linked the national consciousness that had been developing through the 19th century to the name and history of the Assyrians, and this identification persists in the community today. Briefly, I'm going to give you just a sense of Assyrian nationalism by describing some of its most obvious manifestations. In this way, you can better understand really how radically new it is. And this is where I regret I didn't use images, because there's a fascinating visual archive of Assyrianizing from the 1920s onwards, both the use of the images from ancient Nineveh and things that are kind of marked as Assyrian, but also in church architecture. It just pictures, I end up sitting and looking at them, and I get too distracted. Today, some Assyrians celebrate the 1st of Nisan as the Assyrian New Year. And this has been re-rendered by some as the revived ancient Assyrian Akitu festival, at which some celebrants even dress in faux ancient Assyrian garb, including fake long beards. At times, Assyrian nationalists even engage in esoteric readings of scripture, such as a rather heterodox interpretation of God's self-revelation at Exodus 3:14, I am who I am, in Hebrew, Ehyeh Asher Ehyeh. This line is taken to be a hidden revelation of the ancient Assyrian divinity, Ashur. What people do is, because in Semitic languages you can write without the vowels, and the relative pronoun who or which in Hebrew, Asher, if you change the vowels, you can make it look like Ashur, like the ancient Near Eastern god. And so Exodus 3:14 is taken as a kind of a secret revelation that the god of the Assyrians is actually in the biblical text. This is definitely not Orthodox Christianity. This line is taken to be a hidden some Assyrian nationalist literature even argues that the Bible is a biased document, a piece of anti-Assyrian propaganda, hence the description of the Assyrians as warlike. A notable example of the synthesis between the church and Assyrian identity is the renaming of the church itself. It's today called the Assyrian Church of the East. Now, this is theologically problematic too. To name a church ethnically like this it's like saying like Roman Catholic is theologically problematic, right? Because that makes something not so Catholic. It's like in the Mel Brooks film To Be or Not to Be, when Anne Bancroft's character says about her husband that he's world famous in Poland. There's a kind of universalizing and limiting at the same time. So what happens when two Christianities meet? One issue that came up while working on this project was finding a way to talk about the encounter between two different Christianities. I never resolved this question for myself. Whereas in my mission book, I focused on the direct effects of evangelicalism on the East Syrian community, One related phenomenon is how in this encounter with American missionaries, the East Syrians discovered certain parts of their own tradition to be more useful for communicating with the Americans. Parts of their own tradition that corresponded with the missionaries' own Christian idiom. In turn, the Americans drew out these points of contact, and in this back and forth translation, certain long-established tendencies within the East Syrian tradition were activated, but with a new valence. And it would be interesting to take this, and if any, I don't know if any work has been done really thinking about Christian mission contact. So, for example, Mormonism and other forms of Christianity, and how Mormonism spreads in certain ways among other Christians, or with this question from this morning of like the Pentecostalization of the church, that it's really two different Christianities meeting and how that works. Although in their scale and practice, missions are modern institutions, the Christianity of the missionaries clearly fit into the wide-ranging Christian tradition, which demonstrates a number of characteristics common to most instantiations of Christianity. Aside from the obvious ones, such as a focus on Scripture or Jesus, right? Most Christians like Jesus. Included among these characteristics are the idea of conversion, the problem of enculturation, that is the relationship between Christianity and culture, the notion of the imitation of Christ, which is best attested in martyrdom, and the regular epistemological, experiential, and ontological distinction between immanence and transcendence. The notion of reform, which is intensified in modern missions, is another characteristic of this discursive tradition. Multiple strains of Christianity commonly posit the possibility of transforming the human being, of recreating from its fallen state the human created in the beginning in the image of God. Accordingly, Christianization has always entailed a notion of reform, as well as the delimitation of Christianity itself through creed and practices. And because instrumental to proselytism is the objectification of Christianity, right? Because you have to define what it is that you're trying to convey to people. All encounters entail a dialectical interaction in which certain practices, ideas, and language are drawn out due to the useful proximities discovered in such interaction. All forms of contact and communication result in a kind of self-discovery. Like, this works, this doesn't work, try a little more of this. What I'm interested in here is this kind of reflexive negotiation and discovery of commonalities, but specifically when two Christianities meet. So I'm going to provide 4 examples of this from this encounter between the Americans and the Syrians. First, the Hebrew Bible has built into it what we may call a language of nations. Scholars of nationalism, especially Anthony Smith, have emphasized that in the development of nationalism in the modern period, the language of peoplehood we find in the Bible was especially productive. Israel was a great nation. It had enemies among the various nations. The language of peoplehood we find in the Hebrew Bible has long served Christians as a source for thinking about community, whether Christianity was a nation from among the many nations, in contrast to the one nation, the Jews, or in the Pauline emphasis on spreading the gospel to the nations, that is, the Gentiles. Because the East Syrian tradition had already employed this language of biblical nationhood, they seemed to recognize such language when American missionaries brought with them a similar version of it, albeit one inflected through American Protestantism and republicanism. Furthermore, this was an inflection that was more racialized than anything the East Syrians had known before. A second related example. The East Syrians called themselves Eastern and placed themselves within a Christian geography. They were the Church of the East. In this case, the East originally meant east of the Roman Empire, that is, Sasanian or pre-Islamic Iran. It also meant east of Jerusalem and the imagined homeland of monasticism, Egypt. The title East also distinguished them from their historical theological adversaries, the West Syrians, or the Syrian Orthodox, who originally inhabited Roman Syria. This geographical Easternness took on a symbolic significance over time and contributed to the development of a sacred geography. For example, the Gospel of Matthew's wise men from the East, the Magi, were imagined by some East Syrians as being from their own land. The story of Jonah and the Ninevites was particularly popular among Syriac Christians. Jonah's tomb, so it was thought, was right there across the Tigris, from Mosul. This self-consciousness about the East would eventually be conducive to the auto-orientalizing that the East Syrians engaged in once they met foreign missionaries who brought with them American and European ideas of the Orient. And it's noteworthy that some of the missionaries and later some of the missionized East Syrians were significant Orientalist scholars in their own day. From the late 19th century on, Syriac Christians traveled in England and the US, where they would speak their native Neo-Aramaic before crowds of enthusiastic Protestants. Introduced as museum piece holdovers from the age of the patriarchs, they performed the so-called language of Jesus and brought to life a Christian fantasy of the Orient. Thus, it is not surprising that it was in the context of Western missions that the name Assyrian took hold. All Christians knew Assyria, and the name Assyrian was a retrieval with pedigree. A third example of how the East Syrian tradition was drawn upon within the missionary encounter due to a shared heritage. And this is where it starts to get kind of weird but interesting. From 1849 on, the American mission printed the monthly periodical Rays of Light, Zahrire de Bahra. This newspaper had several sections, including ones on science, education, and news. The front section, which was devoted to piety, was given the title Fear of God, Dekhlat Allah. This focus on piety, as distinct from news or science, reflects what will later be the secularity that emerges at the mission. That is, religion is different from news and science. It's noteworthy that this newspaper was in Neo-Aramaic and Dekhlat Allah is a classical Syriac expression. Considering the general absence of interest in the indigenous tradition among the early American missionaries, it is striking that they decided to appropriate and employ this classical Syriac expression so prominently. This expression has a long history in classical Syriac, and fear at times functions in Syriac not wholly unlike our own category of religion. Obviously, the expression fear of God is partly based upon biblical usage, such as Proverbs 9:10, the fear of God is the beginning of wisdom. But in Syriac literature, fear, dekhlitha, has a vibrant life of its own. There are various fears. Most fears are false: Judaism, paganism, heresy. But one, Christianity, is the true fear, the fear of God. This expression is used most often in classical Syriac literature in the so-called Persian martyr acts. The Persian martyr acts are a large corpus of Syriac martyrological texts composed from the 4th century into the Islamic period. They detail the martyrdom of a diversity of Christians at the hands of Sasanian kings, bureaucrats, and priests. Martyrdom is a productive genre for the discourse of religion because martyrdom is about communal and creedal boundaries and the articulation of the definitive difference that makes a Christian a Christian. Martyrdom is also about the false, ultimate object of fear, death. Thus, it is not a coincidence that this word, dekhlitha, fear, is used in this literature most often as a technical term for something approximating religion or piety. What is discussed in the Fear of God section of the American Mission newspaper? So this classical terms taken up by the Americans. Interestingly, this opening section of the paper, which was dedicated to general calls for devotion and leading a more pious life, disproportionately focused on death. It borrowed the contemporary American and British homiletic focus on death, especially death before one's time, to promote a distinctly evangelical devotion. Often, and this is like about a quarter of the time, this section of the paper consisted of an obituary for someone from the local community who had died young. That these long, pathetic life narratives with extensive deathbed scenes were published several years after the death of their subjects demonstrates their ultimately homiletical as opposed to informational value. So they were putting obituaries at the front of the paper, but for people who had died like 3 or 4 years earlier. Fear of God was an expression that in the classical Syriac tradition had meant correct piety, especially as demonstrated by the martyr in the moment of her or his impending death. Now it meant a correct every man's piety through an evangelical acceptance of salvation by faith alone, salvation that was performed through its prefigurement on the deathbed. In both cases, the identification of the correct object of fear, that is, God instead of death, was employed to demonstrate what piety is. Now, a fourth and final example. of this meeting, commonality between the two churches. The idea of reform. In my mission book, I linked the idea of reform to missionary modernity. However, reform is also part of Christianity's long story. In his 1959 study, The Idea of Reform, Gerhard Ladner provides his well-known definition. He suggests reform is, quote, the idea of free, intentional, and ever-perfectible, multiple, prolonged, and ever-repeated efforts by man to reassert and augment values pre-existent in the spiritual material compound of the world. For Ladner, reform lies at the heart of Christianity, and it entails a this-worldly restoration of something that is also not of this world. Ladner's emphasis is on reform as an idea mobilizing Christians across history, and he seems to be, he's like engaged in a kind of old-fashioned Marx Weber debate. I think it would be better to describe reform as a characteristic of the Christian discursive tradition, that is, part of an embodied and given argument that develops through time. Ladner is useful because his work suggests how reform is not simply what occurred in the Reformation, or before this in the High Middle Ages. Rather, some form of it seems always to be part of the tradition. Certainly in Western churches in the post-Reformation period, reform became a focus, motivating many and playing itself out in the missionary field. In fact, the competing Western missions of the 19th century may be understood as divergent versions of reform. However, ideas about reform were already prevalent among the East Syrians. As we've seen already with the ideas about nation and Christian geography and the linkage between death and piety, missionaries and indigenous Christians at times spoke a similar Christian idiom. Missionaries' calls for renewal would have been familiar to East Syrians, whose own tradition held that human beings received a renewal, chudata is the Syriac, the classical term, by the coming of Christ. The Church of the East had long emphasized the idea of restoring that image of God which was diminished by Adam's transgression. Penitence, teyavutha, literally return, was a part of the East Syrian devotion. The abundant East Syrian literature of monastic spirituality of the early Islamic period demonstrates that a particular tradition of care for the self had developed within the church. In one episode, early at the American mission, a local bishop, in response to lectures about temperance from American teetotalers, so this bishop was annoyed because Americans were like going, you shouldn't drink. He indignantly brought out a manuscript of an East Syrian monastic writer who condemned the misuse of alcohol. The East Syrians had their own tradition of moral reform. However, eventually, American ideas of renewal resonated with the local tradition in a new and secular way. By the early 20th century, East Syrians were regularly calling for the moral reform, but of their nation. So, bringing these genealogical lines together, and this is where I tried to use a linguistic model and decided it didn't work. The distant genealogical links between American and also European Christianity and that of the Church of the East resulted in a new articulation of ancient tendencies within East Syrian Christianity. Ideas of nationality and Easternness, fear as a category of piety, ideas of renewal and reform, all these were part of the indigenous East Syrian tradition. These tendencies were articulated in a new way in response to the missionary encounter and contributed to the development of Assyrian nationalism, which went truly global in the aftermath of the Assyrian genocide. Now, I originally thought, and this was in my abstract actually, I would bring in an analogy from linguistics to think about the meeting of American and East Syrian Christians. It is the case that genetically related languages allow for intralinguistic transfer more easily. For example, like Spanish and Italian speakers or Akkadian and Aramaic speakers are more likely to influence one another linguistically because of the proximity of their respective languages. So using a linguistic model for thinking about culture, this wouldn't be new, and it also has its problems. This is common. In fact, we use a linguistic model in talking about translation all the time in the missionary encounter. Borrowing between cognate languages, or among dialects of the same language, that is internal borrowing, is more difficult to identify than contact between distinct languages because the borrowing may be seamlessly intertwined with existing paradigms. How do we identify what comes from where when the two are so similar? So this is just the question of endogenous versus exogenous change. If we treat the Christianity of American evangelicals and that of the East Syrians as cognate languages or distantly related dialects of the same language, would this help us think about their encounter? These two distantly related languages have a shared heritage that is multi-layered. They both have derivations from the ancient Near East through the Hebrew Bible and early Judaism, from the New Testament and early Christian tradition, and from late antique Hellenism and patristics. One, however, then followed its course through the Latin West, medieval Europe, the Reformation, the Enlightenment, and further developed in North America. The other developed its own tradition while interacting with other Eastern Christians, prospered under the Abbasids, persisted with and within Arabicization and the Islamization of the Middle East, and had already been engaging with Catholicism since the 16th century. A problem one hits upon when trying to use a linguistic analogy for how these two forms of Christianity interacted is that the result of the mission encounter was a new entity, a kind of third language, Assyrian nationalism. To be more explicit in my analogy, and this is why I think it doesn't really work, is what if German and English speakers lived next to one another and some aspects of English that it shared with German were drawn out in such a way that it was no longer English at all, perhaps not even a language at all, but some kind of new mode of communication, a language turned inside out. Oh, okay, yeah. The linguistic analogy is awkward. In it, what is the nationalism that emerges from two Christianities? A third language or something just totally different? And maybe this reconfiguration into a new structure has something to do with what is distinctive about the global. And so now I'm going to return to the global for a moment. Briefly, to return to the question of the global, this no doubt reflects my own limited engagement with this problem, because I hide behind saying I'm an ancient historian. But at first glance, I did not see how global Christianity is a particularly beneficial heuristic tool, except to designate the conversation in which we are all engaged here today in similar conversations. What I mean is that it seems to be more useful as a disciplinary reification than as a term of analysis. Is there something distinctly global about global Christianity? Or is it not rather a form of analysis that interdisciplinarily takes into account the movements and flows of modernity? The global has always been part of Christianity since the Great Commission. Christians are asked to go forth and seek disciples and to bear witness even to the ends of the earth. That sounds global. Moreover, as I already stated, the long history of the Church of the East challenges the notion that the global, in this simple sense, is a useful term for identifying something distinctive about Christianity in our own time. However, the process of contact and drawing out of specific features shared between American evangelicals and the East Syrians, and the resultant secular nationalism, and how this nationalism has affected the Christianity itself of the Church of the East, this is something new. Nationalism, the unintended consequence of the mission encounter, emerged along with the religion-secular binary within the East Syrian community, and this was part of the modern process of religionization. That is, the emergence of religion as a discourse and then the proliferation of religion and religions all over the world through missions, colonies, and capitalism. To be sure, already in Christianity in the Roman Empire, we witness a new type of entity, one that would eventually in the modern period become religion. This entity, a portable set of creedal statements that is more easily disembedded than the ethno-religiosity of ancient religion, was further constituted in modernity when the secular became its binary other. Secularization and religionization were concomitant with one another, and then out of this comes world religion, the idea of world religions also. So I end now with the speculative suggestion that something distinctive about global Christianity is its complex imbrication within global secularism, or better to be more precise, within global secularity in its various configurations and contestations. So this is the question I'd like to end with. How is global Christianity, if it's not just a label for a discipline, related to global secularism? Or in other words, and to be more precise, would it be useful to ask how the global in global Christianity may in fact reflect something of the modern binary of religion and the secular, and the ways the conditions of belief have shifted in the modern world? Thank you.
Thanks very much, Professor Becker, for this very interesting and engaging paper.